Chicago. January. A courtroom on the 14th floor where the heating had stopped working and nobody bothered to fix it. Ethan Cole sat at the defendant's table in a worn charcoal suit, hands flat against the wood jaw, still. Across the aisle, Rebecca arrived in a camel wool coat that cost more than his monthly rent. She didn't acknowledge him, not even a glance. She set her designer bag down, crossed her legs, and whispered something to her attorney, Daniel Brooks. Brooks smiled. Then she smiled. The kind of smile people wear when the outcome has never been in question. Brooks read Ethan's failures into the record like a man reciting a grocery list. Unemployed, unstable, unfit. Rebecca examined her nails. When the papers arrived, Ethan picked up the pen and signed without a word. The room exhaled into quiet contempt. They believed they had watched a man disappear and called it justice. What no one understood not yet was that Ethan Cole had not come to that courtroom to fight. He had come to finish something. Nobody in that courtroom had expected the morning to be interesting. The case of Cole versus Cole had been on the docket for 11 months, a custody dispute with a foregone conclusion, the kind that family court judges handled before their second cup of coffee. One party had money, a stable home, a new husband with a firm handshake, and a LinkedIn profile full of endorsements. The other party had a lease on a one-bedroom apartment in Pilsen and a resume with a 2-year gap that nobody had bothered to explain. The judge had reviewed the financials. The math was not complicated. Daniel Brooks understood this. He had built his entire career on cases where the math was not complicated. He stood at the front of the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had already won, because in his experience, men like Ethan Cole did not win. They showed up. They sat down. They signed. And then they went back to wherever men like them went, and the rest of the world moved on. Brooks adjusted his cufflinks and began. He walked the court through Ethan's employment history, or rather, the absence of one. Ethan had left his position at a mid-sized technology firm in the spring of the previous year. No new employer, no freelance contracts on record, no documentation of income beyond a modest savings account that Brooks described with visible satisfaction as insufficient to maintain a child's standard of living at even a basic level. Rebecca sat beside Brooks and nodded at appropriate intervals. She had dressed for this the way some women dressed for a first date. The camel coat folded neatly over the back of her chair, now a silk blouse underneath gold at her ears. Her new husband, Marcus Webb, hadn't come. There was no need. Rebecca had Brooks, and Brooks was enough. At one point, Brooks gestured toward Ethan with an open hand, a casual, almost dismissive motion, as though presenting a minor exhibit, and said that his client's only concern was the well-being of their son, Noah, who deserved stability, continuity, and a home environment that could actually provide for his future. Ethan did not react. He sat with his hands folded on the table and looked at a fixed point somewhere near the middle distance, the way a man looks when he has already decided not to let anything reach him. His attorney, a quiet woman named Sandra Holt, who charged a third of what Brooks did, leaned over once and whispered something to him. Ethan gave a small nod. That was the extent of his participation for the first 40 minutes of the hearing. Then Brooks slid the settlement agreement across to Sandra, and Sandra slid it to Ethan, and Ethan read it. He read it slowly. Not the way a man reads something that surprises him more, the way a man reads something he has been expecting for a long time and wants to make sure is exactly right. His eyes moved down the page with a stillness that to anyone watching closely did not look like defeat. It looked like verification. The key terms were straightforward. Ethan would relinquish primary custody of Noah to Rebecca. He would not seek spousal support. He would retain limited visitation rights every other weekend, one evening per week, subject to Rebecca's scheduling discretion. And buried near the bottom of the second page, in the language that Sandra had quietly flagged during their last meeting, and Ethan, had quietly told her to leave. Untouched was the clause both parties had agreed to include. A mutual waiver, all rights to each other's assets, present undisclosed or arising in the future, formally and permanently relinquished by both parties upon signing. Rebecca had insisted on it. Her new husband's attorneys had drafted it. The intent had been to ensure that Ethan could never come back later and claim a share of whatever Marcus Webb had built or would build. It was from their perspective a clean severance, a door locked from the outside. What Rebecca's attorneys had not considered, and what Sandra had spent considerable effort confirming, was that the clause applied exclusively to personal assets, as defined under Illinois marital property law. Ethan's stake in the holding company had been structured as a corporate asset registered under a legal entity that predated the divorce proceedings. It was not a personal asset, was not subject to disclosure in the settlement, and it was not touched by the waiver Rebecca had so carefully insisted upon. Sandra had never lied in a filing. She had simply answered the questions that were asked. Ethan signed the document without hesitation and passed it back to Sandra. Brooks permitted himself a small smile. Rebecca uncrossed and recrossed her legs. Someone near the back of the gallery coughed into the silence. The judge reviewed the signed agreement, confirmed both parties had received independent legal counsel, and adjourned the hearing in under 4 minutes. In the hallway outside, Rebecca accepted a phone call and walked toward the elevator without looking back. Brooks shook hands with her paralegal, mentioned something about a dinner reservation, and followed. The doors closed. The 14th floor went quiet. Ethan sat alone on a wooden bench near the stairwell and looked at his hands. He had grown up in Gary, Indiana, the kind of place that teaches a person early that the world does not hand you anything, and that the few things worth having have to be built from scratch, quietly, without announcing yourself. His older brother Ryan had been the one with the vision. Ethan had been the one who knew how to make the vision work. Between them, they had understood things about systems and structures, and the way money moved through technology that most people their age were only beginning to learn. Ryan had died 3 years earlier. A diagnosis, then a decline, then a Thursday morning phone call that Ethan had not been prepared for, despite having had months to prepare. What Ryan left behind beyond the grief was a stake in a small artificial intelligence company he had co-founded during the last years of his life, a company that had not yet become what it was becoming. Ethan had not told Rebecca about the inheritance, not because he had planned anything, then he hadn't not yet, but because by the time Ryan died, the marriage was already a different thing than it had started as. He had found messages he wasn't meant to find. He had seen transfers in their joint account that didn't correspond to anything Rebecca had mentioned. He had begun quietly and without confrontation to understand the shape of what his life had become. The shares sat in a trust under the name of a holding company Ethan had formed with Sandra's guidance, structured as a corporate entity, not a personal asset, which meant it fell entirely outside the scope of marital property disclosure under Illinois law. The company had no public face, no press releases, no visible connection to a man in a worn charcoal suit sitting outside a family courtroom in Chicago. By the time the divorce proceedings began, those shares had appreciated to a value that appeared in no personal filing, under no individual name. The holding company was a legal entity with its own standing, and the settlement being negotiated pertained exclusively to personal assets, as defined, drafted, and insisted upon by Rebecca's own legal team. He had not lied. He had simply allowed them to ask the wrong questions. In the weeks that followed, Ethan moved through the city like a man who had been edited out of his own life. He picked up Noah on alternating weekends from the doorstep of the house in Lincoln Park that Marcus Webb had purchased the previous spring, a 4-bedroom colonial with a black front door and a security camera above the porch light. Rebecca rarely appeared at the door herself. Usually it was the housekeeper, or Marcus, who had the handshake and the LinkedIn profile and the expression of a man tolerating something distasteful. Once Noah tugged at Ethan's sleeve as they walked to the car and asked why Daddy didn't come inside anymore. Ethan said that sometimes things changed, but that didn't mean anything important had changed. Noah seemed to consider this. He was 6 years old and had recently become very serious about this kind of question. That evening, after dropping Noah back at the Colonial with the black front door, Ethan sat in his car for a long time before driving home. Not because he was broken, not because he was lost, because he needed to be certain, completely unambiguously certain, that what he was doing was worth the cost of moments like that one, worth the particular weight of a child's hand on your sleeve, and a question you couldn't fully answer yet. He decided that it was. He started the car and drove back to Pilsen to the one-bedroom apartment with the second-hand desk and the 3 monitors that nobody who visited, nobody who was allowed to visit, would ever have reason to connect to anything significant. Somewhere across the city in the 43rd floor offices of a venture capital firm that Ethan had never publicly entered a portfolio that bore no visible trace of his name, had just crossed a threshold that changed what was possible. The man they had dismissed in that courtroom wasn't disappearing. He was positioning. Spring came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits with cold mornings that refused to commit to warmth until well past noon. Ethan learned the city differently that season, not as a resident with somewhere to be, but as a man learning the specific geography of what had been taken from him. Every other Saturday, he drove to Lincoln Park and waited at the curb. He never rang the doorbell. He had made that mistake once in February, and Marcus Webb had answered in a fleece vest and the expression of a man who considered the doorbell an intrusion on his property. Marcus hadn't said anything overtly hostile. He didn't need to. The way he stepped into the doorframe, filling it, occupying it, communicated everything. Ethan had taken a step back without meaning to. He hadn't done it again. Now he waited at the curb. Noah would come running down the front path with his backpack listing sideways, and Ethan would catch him and straighten the straps, and they would drive somewhere. The aquarium, the library on State Street. Sometimes just the park near Ethan's apartment in Pilsen, where Noah liked to climb the same boulder 3 times in a row for reasons he never fully articulated. One Saturday in April, Rebecca appeared at the front door as Ethan was buckling Noah into the back seat. She stood on the top step in a weekend outfit that looked curated, the kind of casual that takes effort, and called out across the lawn. "He has a dentist appointment Tuesday," she said. "I need him back by 5 on Sunday, not 6. Ethan looked up. Sandra and I agreed on 6. "Marcus has a dinner." She said it the way people say things that have already been decided. 5 works better. Ethan held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have him back at 5:30, and got in the car. In the rearview mirror, he saw Rebecca watching them pull away. Not with anger exactly, with the mild, disinterested attention of someone monitoring something they considered already resolved. Noah, already pulling a book from his backpack, didn't notice any of it. What Rebecca did not see, what no one was meant to see, happened in the hours after Noah was returned to the black front door, and Ethan drove back across the city to his apartment. The second-hand desk, the 3 monitors, the AI startup that Ryan had co-founded before his death, had spent its first years in the particular obscurity that precedes either collapse or explosion. It had spent the last 18 months accelerating toward the latter. The technology, a natural language infrastructure system designed for enterprise integration, had attracted quiet attention from the kind of investors who did not announce their interest publicly. Ethan had spent those 18 months making decisions that never appeared in any filing connected to his name. The holding company had since expanded into something larger, working with Sandra and a financial advisor named Thomas Greer, a man who understood the architecture of discretion and had spent 20 years building structures that were entirely legal and entirely invisible to casual scrutiny. Ethan had restructured the original entity into a broader investment fund, operating under the name Ardent Capital. Through Ardent, he had been rolling returns into a wider portfolio, a data logistics firm in Austin, a healthcare analytics platform, positions in 3 early-stage infrastructure companies that were no longer early-stage. The fund was not small anymore. Greer called Ethan on a Thursday evening in May. "The Webb Group filed amended quarterly projections this morning," Greer said. "Revised down by 31%. Their commercial real estate division is carrying debt they haven't publicly disclosed. I've seen the analysis. It's not a rough quarter. It's structural." Ethan looked at the monitor on his left, where a column of figures had been sitting since the previous week. How long before they need outside capital? If rates hold and their anchor tenant in the River North project doesn't renew, Greer's tone was even professional. 8 months, maybe 10. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, "Keep watching." He ended the call and sat back in his chair and thought about Marcus Webb standing in a doorframe in a fleece vest, filling the space like a man who had never once considered that space could be taken from him. The parallel lives they were living, Ethan's and Rebecca's, would have been unrecognizable to each other had either been allowed to see them clearly. On a Friday evening in June, Rebecca posted a photograph from a rooftop restaurant in the West Loop. She and Marcus dressed well, the city glittering behind them. The caption mentioned something about celebrating. Several hundred people responded warmly. The comments included words like "goals" and "beautiful," and "you two deserve everything." That same evening in the Pilsen apartment, Ethan was on a call with the board of Ardent Capital, finalizing a term sheet for an acquisition they had been structuring for 4 months. The target company was a commercial real estate technology firm with significant overlap in the Chicago market. Overlap specifically with the Webb Group's most vulnerable division. Ethan had not engineered this. He needed to be clear about that, at least with himself. He had not gone looking for Marcus Webb's weakness. He had simply been building quietly, methodically in the dark, and the shape of what he was building had eventually come to occupy the same space as what Marcus Webb was quietly losing. That was not revenge. That was geometry. Still, he would be lying if he said he felt nothing when Greer sent him the Webb Group's latest internal projections, obtained through entirely legitimate channels, and the numbers confirmed what they had already suspected. Marcus Webb was not a bad businessman. He was a man who had borrowed heavily against assets he believed were stable in a market that had shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated quickly enough. He had made decisions that looked reasonable from the outside and were quietly catastrophic from the inside. And he had for the past 1.5 years been presenting his family's financial situation to Rebecca and to the world as something considerably more secure than it actually was. Rebecca did not know. Ethan was certain of that. Whatever her faults, she was not a woman who would have tolerated uncertainty of that magnitude without demanding it be addressed. She believed genuinely that she had chosen correctly. She had left a struggling man for a successful one, secured her son's future with a home in Lincoln Park and a black front door and a security camera, and constructed a life that looked exactly like what she had wanted. She did not know that the foundation of that life had been borrowing against itself for 18 months. There was a moment in late July, Noah's birthday weekend, when the weight of what Ethan was carrying became almost physical. He had taken Noah to the aquarium. Noah was 7 now, solemn and curious in the way that children who spend time alone often become, asking questions about the jellyfish that Ethan couldn't fully answer, and seeming satisfied by honesty in a way that most adults weren't. They ate hot dogs on a bench outside afterward, and Noah leaned against Ethan's arm the way he had always done, the way that required no maintenance or explanation, and Ethan sat very still because he didn't want to shift and disturb it. "Dad," Noah said, watching a pigeon assess a discarded bun, "are you okay?" Ethan looked at him. "What makes you ask that?" "You look like you're thinking really hard about something." "I am," Ethan said. "Is it about work?" "Sort of." Noah considered the pigeon who had made its decision and was now fully committed. Marcus says you don't have a real job. The words landed without drama, delivered with the flat neutrality of a child reporting something he had heard, and filed away for later examination. Not cruelty, just information. Ethan chose his next words the way he always chose them now, slowly, with the understanding that what he said to this boy would outlast almost anything else he did. "I have a job," he said. "It's just not the kind of job that looks like much from the outside right now." Noah seemed to find this acceptable. He finished his hot dog. The pigeon departed, and Ethan sat with the particular ache of a man who has made a calculated sacrifice and must live inside the cost of it every time his son leans against his arm. He did not waver, but he felt it. By September, the acquisition structure was complete. Ardent Capital, with Ethan as its controlling principal separated from public view by 2 layers of legal structure that Sandra and Greer had spent the better part of a year constructing, had positioned itself as the lead buyer for a portfolio of distressed commercial real estate technology assets in the Midwest. The Webb Group's River North anchor tenant had not renewed. Their debt exposure had been quietly confirmed by 3 independent analyses. They were, as of the first week of October, actively seeking a buyer for their technology division. They were seeking, without knowing it, the one buyer who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The announcement came through proper channels the way these things always did. A press release, an event, a gala at a hotel in the Gold Coast on a Thursday evening in November, to be attended by investors, journalists, and the principals of both organizations. Marcus Webb's name was on the invitation as the selling party. The acquiring entity was listed under Ardent Capital. Ethan's name appeared nowhere on the invitation. He read it twice on the screen in the Pilsen apartment, then closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while. He thought about a courtroom on the 14th floor, a woman who hadn't looked at him once, a settlement agreement with a clause that had been meant as a lock. He thought about Noah leaning against his arm outside the aquarium, asking if he was okay. Then he opened the laptop again, confirmed his attendance with the event coordinator, and typed a single line to Thomas Greer. Thursday. Let's finish this. Across the city in the Lincoln Park house with the black front door, Rebecca was deciding what to wear to the gala. Marcus had told her it was important, a major acquisition, a turning point for the company, an evening that would signal publicly and definitively that the Webb Group had navigated its rough period and emerged stronger. She chose something ivory, something that photographed well. She had no reason to think the evening would be anything other than what Marcus had described. She raised her glass. She had no idea whose table she was sitting at. The Gold Coast Hotel had been dressed for the occasion. White floral arrangements ran the length of the signing table. A photographer from a business publication circled the room with quiet professionalism, capturing handshakes and champagne flutes, and the particular expression that people wear when they believe they are being witnessed at their best. The ballroom held perhaps 120 guests, investors, attorneys, commercial real estate brokers, a few journalists who covered the Chicago business beat and had been promised something worth covering. Marcus Webb moved through the room like a man who had been rehearsing this moment for months. He shook hands with the ease of someone who had forgotten temporarily that ease was something he'd had to manufacture. He laughed at the right moments. He kept his glass raised. Beside him, Rebecca worked the room with a fluency born of practice, a warm word here, a meaningful glance. There, the ivory dress catching the light exactly as she had intended. The Webb Group's general counsel, a gray-haired man named Robert Fitch, had briefed Marcus that morning on the final terms. The acquiring entity, Ardent Capital, had been represented throughout negotiations by a senior partner at a downtown firm. Marcus had never met the principal directly. That was not unusual for acquisitions of this structure. Principals sent representatives. Deals were built by intermediaries. The handshake at the end was ceremonial. Marcus checked his watch. 7:43. The formal presentation was scheduled for 8. He did not notice the man who had entered the room 17 minutes earlier and was standing near the far end of the bar speaking quietly with Thomas Greer. Ethan had dressed carefully that evening. Not to impress, he had stopped caring about that particular performance a long time ago, but because he understood that what a person wears in a moment like this becomes part of the story people tell afterward. A dark navy suit, well fitted, no tie. He had his brother's watch on his wrist, the only piece of jewelry Ryan had owned, worth keeping, a simple steel thing that kept near perfect time and had no other significance except that it had been Ryan's. Greer stood beside him and spoke in a low, even voice, going through the sequence one final time. The presentation would begin with a brief summary of the acquisition terms. The ardent capital principal Ethan would be introduced by the firm's managing director, a woman named Carol Weiss, who was the only person in the room besides Greer and Sandra who knew the full shape of what was about to happen. "Rebecca is here," Greer said, not as a warning, just as information. Ethan nodded. He had expected that. Marcus would have wanted her here. This evening was meant to be a statement, a public declaration that the Webb Group had survived its difficulties and emerged with a stronger asset base. Rebecca was part of that statement. She was the evidence of a life that had been constructed to look a certain way. He looked across the room and found her without difficulty. She was laughing at something a woman in a red dress had said, her hand briefly touching the other woman's arm, in that gesture of performed intimacy that comes easily to people who have learned to move through rooms like this one. She looked genuinely happy. He turned back to his drink. He was not here for her happiness or the absence of it. At 8 o'clock, Carol Weiss stepped to the podium. The presentation was precise and brief. Carol outlined the terms of the acquisition, the technology division of the Webb Group, its assets, its contracts, and its personnel passing to Ardent Capital in a transaction valued at a figure she cited in full. She spoke about strategic alignment. She mentioned the Ardent principal's vision for integrating the acquired assets into a broader portfolio, and then she said his name. "I'd like to introduce the principal and controlling founder of Ardent Capital, Ethan Cole." The room shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight redistribution of attention glasses, lowering heads turning toward the pod side. For most of the room, the name meant nothing. A business figure, a principal, the other signature on the contract, but not for everyone. Daniel Brooks was standing near the second row of seats with a glass of sparkling water and an expression that did not change so much as recalibrate, a visible, rapid recalibration, the kind that happens when a legal mind encounters information it needs to immediately reassess against prior work. His eyes moved from Ethan's face to somewhere in the middle distance, and anyone watching him closely would have seen the exact moment the mutual waiver clause surfaced in his memory, like something cold, rising from deep water. At the far side of the room, Marcus Webb had gone very still. Rebecca turned from the woman in the red dress. She looked toward the podium. She looked at the man standing there in the navy suit with her son's eyes, because Noah had always had his father's eyes, a fact she had never mentioned and had never quite been able to stop noticing, and something moved across her face that was not quite recognition and not quite understanding, and was both of those things entirely. Ethan stepped to the podium. He thanked Carol. He acknowledged the room, and then in the measured, unhurried tone of a man who had been waiting a long time to say exactly this and had decided somewhere along the way that the saying did not need to be spectacular to be complete, he began to speak. He spoke about the acquisition, about the technology assets, about Ardent Capital's existing portfolio and its strategic direction. He was factual, unembellished professional, and then near the end, still in that same unhurried tone, he mentioned that, in the interest of full disclosure to investors and journalists present, he wanted to address certain financial information regarding the Webb Group that had not been reflected in their public filings. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. Ethan walked through the numbers without editorializing. The amended quarterly projections, the undisclosed debt in the commercial real estate division, the River North anchor tenant's departure and its downstream effect on the company's liquidity position. He cited sources, the independent analyses, the amended filings, the documentation that Greer had assembled over 18 months, with the methodical patience of a man building a case that would hold up to any scrutiny because it was simply irrefutably true. He did not raise his voice. He did not look at Rebecca. When he finished, a journalist in the third row had already started typing. What followed did not happen in a single evening. That was the part that stories often compressed, the part where real consequences moved at the speed of institutions rather than drama. But the gala was the door, and once it opened, everything behind it came through with the inevitability of water finding its level. The financial reporting began within 48 hours, not sensational, factual, documented, the kind of coverage that carries weight precisely because it doesn't reach for effect. The Webb Group's investors requested emergency disclosures. The amended filings were pulled and reviewed by 3 separate parties. By the following week, 2 of Marcus Webb's largest commercial partners had issued notices of concern. Robert Fitch, the general counsel, called Daniel Brooks the morning after the gala. Brooks had already reviewed the settlement agreement from the Cole divorce proceeding 3 times by then. He understood immediately what he was looking at, and he understood that there was nothing to be done about it. The mutual waiver was airtight. The holding company had been a corporate asset, not a personal one. The structure was legal documented and predated the divorce. There was no fraud, no concealment within the meaning of the statute, and no viable path to challenge the agreement. Brooks withdrew from any further representation of Rebecca's interests that same afternoon, citing a conflict that he did not elaborate upon. Rebecca retained a new attorney to review her options. The assessment was delivered within a week, and it was brief. The waiver she had insisted upon stood. Ethan's assets. Ardent Capital, the AI portfolio, the holding company, the entirety of what he had built in the years since the divorce, were beyond her reach, secured by the very legal instrument her own team had drafted to protect her. The lock they had put on the door had locked them out. By December, Marcus Webb's technology division had been formally transferred to Ardent Capital. The remaining divisions of the Webb Group were in restructuring. The Lincoln Park Colonial, the house where Noah had lived for the past year, with its security camera above the porch and the housekeeper who answered the door on Saturday mornings, had been purchased with financing that was now being reviewed as part of a broader asset assessment. Rebecca did not call Ethan. He had not expected her to. There was a moment in the weeks between the gala and the custody hearing when Ethan sat with Sandra Holt in her office, and she asked him with the directness he had always appreciated in her whether he wanted to push further. "You have standing," she said. "Given the material change in Noah's home environment, the financial instability, the restructuring, you could request an emergency modification. Move fast. Hit hard." Ethan looked at the table between them for a long moment. He thought about what hitting hard would look like from Noah's perspective. A 7-year-old boy who had already watched one version of his family dissolve in a courtroom, who had already learned to ask his father if he was okay, because the adults around him had given him reasons to notice these things. A child who deserved above everything else to grow up without becoming the terrain on which his parents settled their accounts. "File for modification," Ethan said. "Standard process. I want the hearing to be clean." Sandra made a note. "That's the slower path." "I know." He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I've gotten good at slow." The second custody hearing was held on a Tuesday morning in February one year, and 22 days after the first one. A different courtroom, a different judge, the same 14th floor. Ethan arrived in a different suit, charcoal, still but new, well-fitted in the way that the previous one had not been. Sandra sat beside him with 3 inches of documentation and the practiced stillness of someone who knew the difference between a hard case and a straightforward one. Brooks was not there. Rebecca had a different attorney, a woman named Patricia Solis, competent and professional who had reviewed the original settlement and understood without needing it, explained that the legal landscape had shifted considerably in the past 12 months. The hearing lasted 2 hours. The financial instability of Noah's current home environment was documented. The material change in circumstances was argued carefully and without theatrics. Rebecca's attorney did not contest the core findings. She advocated for continued visitation rights and a transition timeline that would minimize disruption to Noah's schooling. Ethan agreed to both. The judge awarded primary custody to Ethan, with generous and structured visitation for Rebecca, and adjourned before noon. In the hallway outside, Rebecca stood with Patricia Solis near the elevator. She looked for the first time in Ethan's memory like someone who had not prepared for the weather she found herself standing in. Not destroyed, she was too composed for that, too practiced in the management of her own presentation, but diminished in some way that had nothing to do with the clothes she wore or the way she had fixed her hair that morning. She glanced at him once as the elevator doors opened. He held the door for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, not as a gesture of anything, just because it was the kind of thing you did. She stepped in. The doors closed. He picked Noah up from school that Friday. His son came down the front steps of the building with his jacket half zipped and his backpack hanging off one shoulder, and when he saw Ethan's car at the curb, his whole face reorganized itself into something uncomplicated and immediate. They drove back to Pilsen. The apartment was different. Now, larger on the 3rd floor of a building with actual heating, 2 bedrooms, Noah's room already assembled with the furniture Noah had chosen from a catalog over video call the previous month, a bookshelf, a blue comforter, a desk by the window because Noah had recently decided with the gravity of someone making a considered life choice that he preferred to do his homework with natural light. That evening they made dinner together, pasta, which was the one thing Ethan could cook reliably, and Noah could assist with without the result becoming inedible. Noah stood on the step stool at the counter and stirred the sauce with the focused attention he brought to most physical tasks, and Ethan worked beside him, and the kitchen smelled like something ordinary and complete. After dinner, Noah fell asleep on the couch with a book open on his chest, and Ethan sat in the chair across from him in the lamplight and didn't move for a long time. He thought about a courtroom in January, a pen, a signature on a document that everyone in the room had misread in the same direction. He thought about his brother's watch on his wrist and the company Ryan had built in the last years of his life, and what it meant to build something in the time you have with the understanding that you are building it for someone who will come after you. He thought about what it had cost, not the money, not the year of careful invisibility, not even the specific weight of standing at a podium in a Gold Coast hotel and saying true things to a room full of people who had not expected to hear them. What it had cost was the moments he could not get back. The Saturday mornings at the curb, the questions he couldn't fully answer yet, the particular ache of a child's hand on your sleeve asking if you were okay. He looked at Noah asleep on the couch chest, rising and falling book sliding slowly toward the floor. He reached over and caught it before it fell. Outside, Chicago moved through its winter with its usual indifference to individual stories, the traffic and the wind, and the lit windows of 10,000 apartments, where 10,000 ordinary and extraordinary things were happening simultaneously, as they always were, as they always would be. Ethan Cole had not won because he was smarter or richer or more ruthless than the people who had laughed at him in that courtroom. He had won because he had understood something they hadn't, that the most dangerous person in any room is not the one performing strength. It is the one who is patient enough to let the truth do the work. He didn't fight to win. He waited long enough for the truth to win for him.